The text came through while my 18-year-old son was pulling the last tray from the oven. Change of plans. We're eating at a restaurant. Adults only. He had spent the entire day cooking for 29 relatives because my father insisted that family should celebrate at home this year. Every pot on the stove was still steaming. The dining table was dressed in white linen. The birthday cake, my son's third attempt after the first two cracked, waited quietly beneath a glass cover. My son read the message twice. Then he smiled. Not because it was funny, because sometimes disappointment is so sharp that your face forgets how to do anything else. The kitchen suddenly sounded too loud. The timer kept beeping. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, cars rolled past our house carrying people who had somewhere to belong. I guess they changed their minds, he said, folding the phone into his pocket as if it didn't matter. But I saw the way his shoulders dropped. I saw the tiny burn on his wrist from the caramel sauce he'd refused to remake because he was already behind schedule. I saw flour still dusted across his black t-shirt. I saw 18 years of trying to earn the approval of a grandfather who always found a reason to look somewhere else. My father hadn't simply changed dinner plans. He had waited until every dish was finished before deciding my son wasn't welcome. I didn't argue. I didn't call. I didn't send an angry message. I just looked around the kitchen, the feast my son had built with aching hands, the empty chairs waiting for guests who would never arrive, and I realized something with perfect clarity. Some people expect forgiveness because they mistake silence for weakness. I stayed silent. But before the sun came up the next morning, I had already made my move. My name is Claire, and for most of my life, I believed keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting my family. I was the oldest daughter, the one expected to smooth over arguments, apologize for things I never did, and quietly accept whatever scraps of respect were left after. Everyone else had taken their share. My father liked to call it maturity. I eventually realized it was simply obedience wearing a nicer name. My son Ethan inherited none of my father's sharp tongue, only his determination. He worked hard, spoke softly, and somehow still believed that effort could earn affection. Every birthday, holiday, and reunion became another chance for him to prove himself, especially to the grandfather whose approval always seemed one step farther away. Dad praised my brother's children for showing up empty-handed, yet found fault when Ethan arrived carrying homemade desserts or volunteered to clean after everyone had gone home. If Ethan succeeded, Dad called it luck. If he stumbled, Dad called it character building. It was a game with rules designed so my son could never win. I noticed every slight, but I kept convincing myself that confronting them would only create another family war. Silence became my habit, and everyone mistook it for agreement. That was the mistake they all made. They believed I would absorb every insult forever because I always had. They never considered that years of quiet observation had taught me exactly where the family's real power rested, and exactly how fragile that power truly was. There were never any scenes. That was what made it so difficult to explain to people who only saw my father for a few hours at family gatherings. They saw a charming man with easy jokes and generous stories. They never noticed what happened in the spaces between his words. At Thanksgiving, Ethan carried every serving dish to the table while my cousins laughed. In the living room, Dad thanked everyone for pitching in, then looked straight past the person who had done the work. Ethan lowered his eyes, smiled politely, and reached for another empty platter. At Christmas, Ethan spent weeks building my father a handcrafted walnut keepsake box in his woodworking class. Dad opened it, ran a finger across the polished lid, and set it aside without a word. Minutes later, he held up a store-bought coffee mug from another grandchild as though it were a priceless heirloom, making sure everyone admired it before dinner. The pattern never changed. Dad's compliments always landed somewhere else. His pauses carried more weight than his sentences. If Ethan spoke, Dad found someone else's story more interesting. If Ethan succeeded, the conversation drifted away before anyone could congratulate him. The room always seemed to follow my father's lead. Relatives exchanged quick glances, shrugged almost imperceptibly, and continued talking as if nothing unusual had happened. Silence became its own kind of permission. More than once, I caught Ethan watching his grandfather from across the room, searching for the smallest sign of approval, a nod, a smile, even simple eye contact. Instead, Dad would straighten his jacket, turn toward another conversation, and leave that hope hanging unanswered. Each slight was tiny enough to dismiss on its own, Together they formed a language everyone in the family understood, but no one was willing to translate aloud. And by the time that birthday dinner arrived, my father had grown so comfortable with that language that he believed there would never be consequences for speaking it. When Ethan finally untied his apron that night, he didn't ask whether we should save the food or call the restaurant. He simply began covering each dish with foil, one careful movement at a time. The roast was still warm. The bread had barely cooled. The candles he'd arranged down the center of the table remained unlit. Then he looked at me and quietly asked, "Do you think Grandpa was embarrassed to have me there?" That question hurt more than the text message. He wasn't angry that he'd wasted 12 hours cooking. He honestly believed he was the problem. In that moment, I realized my silence had protected the wrong person. Every time I had ignored a cruel remark or explained away another slight, I had taught my son that keeping the peace mattered more than protecting his dignity. I picked up my phone, opened our family group chat, and stared at it for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the keyboard before I locked the screen again. An argument would change nothing. Dad would deny it. My relatives would call it a misunderstanding. By morning, somehow Ethan would be expected to apologize for making everyone uncomfortable. No, I needed something they couldn't explain away. That night after Ethan went to bed, I packed every tray of food into insulated containers. At sunrise, I loaded them into my car and drove to the community shelter where volunteers were already preparing breakfast. By noon, 29 untouched family dinners had become meals for people who greeted my son with something my father had never managed to give him: gratitude. And before the afternoon was over, my phone finally rang. It was my father. For the first time in years, he wasn't calling to give instructions. He was calling because he needed something from me. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Then I placed it face down on the kitchen counter and finished washing the last mixing bowl Ethan had used the day before. If my father wanted my attention, he could wait a few minutes. Waiting was a feeling he had never bothered to understand. When I finally listened to the voicemail, his confidence was gone. "Claire, call me. We need to talk." Not, "I'd like to talk." We need to talk. The difference mattered. For nearly 15 years, I'd handled every family gathering without anyone noticing. I kept the guest lists, booked venues, coordinated birthdays, collected money for anniversary gifts, reminded everyone of dates, and maintained the shared contact list with relatives scattered across 3 states. Because I worked as an operations manager, organizing complicated schedules, budgets, and logistics had become second nature. My family thought those events happened effortlessly. They never realized I was the one holding everything together behind the scenes, so I didn't threaten anyone. I simply stopped doing invisible work for people who treated my son as invisible. That morning, I sent 3 brief messages. The first went to my brother, explaining that I would no longer organize family celebrations. The second went to my cousins, sharing photos of Ethan serving meals at the shelter beside volunteers who had welcomed him with genuine smiles. I added only one sentence: "This is where yesterday's birthday dinner ended up." The third message was private. It went to my father. "You excluded the person who cooked your birthday meal. The food found people who appreciated it instead. From now on, you'll be responsible for planning your own celebrations." No insults, no accusations. Nothing he could twist into an argument. Just facts, and the quiet removal of privileges he had mistaken for entitlements. That was the only move I needed. The consequences arrived exactly the way I expected them to. Not all at once, but in small, unmistakable waves. My father called 6 more times before noon. I didn't answer. My brother eventually texted, asking if I had really stepped away from organizing the annual reunion. I replied with a single sentence: "Yes, someone else can take over this year." For the first time, everyone discovered how much work had always happened before they ever showed up. The restaurant reservation for the next month's anniversary dinner was never made. 2 cousins assumed someone else had ordered the cake. Invitations went out late because nobody had the updated addresses. Tiny problems multiplied into awkward phone calls and last-minute apologies. No one blamed me aloud, but no one could ignore my absence either. Then my aunt called. "I saw the shelter photos," she said softly. Ethan looked happy. He did. Happier than he had looked, waiting for his grandfather's approval. Meanwhile, the pictures quietly made their way through the family chat. Volunteers were smiling beside long tables filled with the meals Ethan had prepared. One image showed an elderly man shaking Ethan's hand while holding a full plate. Another showed children laughing over slices of birthday, cake that had never reached my father's table. No captions were necessary. The contrast told the entire story. Late the next morning, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my father standing on the porch without his usual confidence. His shoulders seemed smaller somehow. His eyes drifted past me, searching the house. I need to see Ethan, he said. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. For the first time in my life, my father understood that respect wasn't something he could expect simply because he was family. It was something he had failed to earn. Word spread through the family faster than I ever expected, not because I had exposed my father, but because I hadn't. There was no dramatic accusation for people to argue about. No angry screenshots, no public humiliation. There were only simple facts that no one could comfortably explain away. One by one, relatives began calling. Some apologized for not questioning the restaurant decision. Others admitted they had assumed Ethan knew about the change. A few stayed silent altogether, and somehow their silence said the most. They had seen the pattern for years. They had simply found it easier to look away. My father's reputation didn't collapse overnight. It shifted quietly. People started noticing things they had ignored before, the interrupted conversations, the forgotten thank yous, the way praise always seemed to stop just short of the people who deserved it most. Once you recognize a pattern, it's almost impossible to unsee it. The biggest change, though, wasn't my father. It was Ethan. He stopped chasing approval that had always come with impossible conditions. He laughed more easily. He volunteered at the shelter twice a month, not because he needed validation, but because he genuinely enjoyed seeing people appreciate what he created. Watching him stand a little taller made me realize what was truly at stake. Children don't only learn from the people who hurt them, they also learn from the people who decide whether that hurt is acceptable. For years, I had taught my son that silence was the price of keeping a family together. Now he had learned something far more valuable. A relationship that depends on swallowing your self-respect isn't peace, it's permission. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself, and for the people you love, is quietly refuse to give that permission ever again. In the months that followed, my father did eventually speak to Ethan. He apologized. In the only way he knew how, awkwardly, without polished words, stopping halfway through sentences as if pride kept catching in his throat. It wasn't the apology I would have written, and it didn't erase years of quiet neglect. But for the first time, he wasn't speaking from a position of authority. He was speaking as someone who finally understood he could lose the people he had taken for granted. Ethan listened politely. Then he accepted the apology without offering the one thing my father expected in return: permission to pretend none of it had happened. That was the healthiest boundary I'd ever seen my son set. We still attended some family gatherings, but on our own terms. If respect disappeared, so did we. There were no arguments, no dramatic exits, no speeches. We simply left. It amazed me how powerful quiet consistency could be. People eventually learned that kindness wasn't optional if they wanted us in the room. As for me, I stopped confusing sacrifice with love. I realized that protecting someone's feelings at the expense of your child's self-worth is not compassion. It's fear dressed up as patience. The day I chose my son's dignity over my father's comfort, something inside me became wonderfully still. Sometimes friends ask whether I regret donating that birthday dinner instead of confronting my father face to face. I always smile, because the meal he rejected fed people who were genuinely grateful. The grandson he dismissed discovered that his talent could bring joy to strangers. And the man who believed family, loyalty guaranteed endless second. Chances learned that respect cannot be inherited, demanded, or manipulated. It must be earned. Looking back, I don't remember the restaurant they chose that night. I remember the shelter. I remember my son's smile. And I remember the moment I finally understood that the strongest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's making sure the people you love never have to beg for their worth again.